People think these places are empty, that power generation sites are built far from anything else. But often they're built where something already existed. And sometimes they attract things and give them power.
Wind farms announce themselves long before you reach them. You see the blades first, white slashes turning slowly against the sky, visible from miles away. From the road, they look graceful, almost calm. But that changes once you're inside the site. Up close, they never stop moving. Even on days that feel still at ground level, the blades turn. Slowly, patiently, one after another, out of sync just enough that you can't tune them out. The sound isn't loud, just a steady pressure, a rhythmic thrum that sits somewhere behind your ears. This one sat high, spread across open ground where the land dropped away on all sides. No villages nearby, no shelter, just wind and sky and towers. The birds knew better. You could see them circling the edges of the farm, riding the thermals up and away, never cutting straight through. They followed invisible curves, paths that bent around the turbines as if the air itself had shape. Closer in, the insects behaved strangely. They didn't scatter, they collected, thick along the leeward sides of certain towers, coating access panels and ladder bases in a way that didn't match the wind direction. Some towers were almost clean, others were slick with them. I walked the service track, boots crunching on gravel, eyes drifting upward more often than I realized. It's hard not to look up here. The sense of scale pulls your attention skyward, whether you want it or not. Between the towers, the wind felt different. Not stronger, just organized, channeled. It moved in straight paths that didn't always match the terrain, cutting between structures as if guided there. Step out of those paths, and the air changed immediately, slackened, shifted, lost interest. Standing still, I became aware of something else. The farm didn't feel like a collection of machines. The towers lined up in ways that made sense only when you stopped thinking of them as points on a grid and started seeing the space between them. From the right angle, the farm looked less like infrastructure and more like a diagram. Lines crossing lines, corridors opening and closing depending on where you stood. I told myself that was just pattern seeking. Long days alone will do that. Still, when a shadow passed high above me, too large, too smooth to be any bird, I caught myself holding my breath until it was gone. The blades never faltered, and the wind kept moving exactly where it wanted to go. I started finding the bodies a few days into the work. Not scattered, not random, always in the same places. Birds first, small ones mostly, lying intact on the ground downwind of certain towers. No obvious injuries, no broken wings, just still. Feathers ruffled as if they'd been set down carefully. Then the bats. They were harder to spot unless you were looking for them. Dark shapes against darker soil, tucked close to the bases of the towers or caught along fence lines. Again, no visible trauma, no blood, no sign they'd been struck. I logged them anyway. Locations, turbine numbers, wind direction at the time. Patterns emerged faster than I expected. It wasn't the whole site. It was specific lines of turbines, ones that ran straight across the farm, ignoring the curve of the land. Deaths clustered along those alignments, thinning out sharply just a few meters to either side. Insects told the same story. Some towers were coated with them, thick enough that maintenance panels needed cleaning far more often than planned. Others, only a short walk away, were almost untouched. The difference wasn't height or position. It was orientation. I started checking the maps more closely. From above, the turbine layout looked tidy, sensible, efficient. But when I overlaid older boundaries, footpaths, parish lines, things that predated the farm by centuries, the matches were hard to ignore. Straight runs where there shouldn't have been any, intersections that lined up too neatly. I asked one of the local lads about it when I stopped at the nearest village after work. He shrugged and said the birds had always avoided that ridge. Said his grandfather used to walk livestock around it rather than over. Bad air, he called it. Thin in places. I laughed at the phrasing. That night, the wind shifted. The next morning, there were more bodies. Bats this time, almost all of them, found beneath the same turbines as before. The weather logs showed nothing extreme. No storms, no gusts strong enough to explain it. Walking between those towers, I felt it in my chest. A faint pressure, like the moment before your ears pop on a plane. It came and went as I crossed invisible boundaries, easing the instant I stepped out of line. Above me, the blades turned in loose synchrony, not locked together, not quite random, aligned just long enough for me to notice. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the towers, watching how birds skirted the edges and refused to cross the open lanes running through the farm. It wasn't a killing field. It was a channel. And whatever moved through it didn't care what it took with it. I didn't start out looking for ley lines. I was just trying to work out why the same turbines kept coming up in the reports. Same numbers, same runs, same downwind zones. When you've logged enough sites, you get used to randomness. This wasn't that. This was repetition pretending to be coincidence. I pulled older maps first, planning documents, land ownership boundaries, the kind of things that only matter on paper. Then I went further back. Parish maps, old rights of way, tracks that no longer existed on the ground but still showed up if you knew where to look. That was when the alignments became obvious. Straight lines cutting across the ridge long before anyone thought about turbines. Paths that ignored terrain, stone walls, even random clumps of trees. Routes that linked nothing useful and yet had been walked for generations. The turbines sat directly on top of them. Not all of them, just enough. Officially, the placement was explained by wind modeling and access constraints. Unofficially, it looked like someone had drawn lines across the land and then dropped towers onto the intersections without quite realizing what they were following. I mentioned it once, casually, to another contractor. He didn't laugh. Said his grandmother used to call those stretches thin places. Places where animals refused to settle. Where weather turned without warning. Where sound didn't travel properly. He said people used to leave offerings at the crossings, just to be safe. He stopped talking after that. Out on site, the behavior got harder to ignore. Birds no longer just avoided the lanes. They stalled at the edges, circling as if something invisible was pushing back. Smaller birds flew lower than they should have, hugging the towers, slipping through gaps between them instead of over the top. Insects moved in sheets now, not swarms, drifting along the same invisible paths that the birds refused to cross. Walking those lines myself, I felt it immediately. The pressure in my ears, the tightness behind my eyes, a faint vibration under my boots that vanished the moment I stepped aside. The air felt worked, processed, like it had been shaped before it reached me. Above, the blades aligned again, just for a few seconds. Enough to create a straight corridor of movement that ran the length of the farm. Wind funneled cleanly through it, faster and smoother than anywhere else on site. Something passed through that corridor. I didn't see it clearly, not as a shape, but the shadow moved wrong. Too broad, too continuous. It crossed from one end of the farm to the other without breaking, sliding between towers in a way nothing with wings should have managed. The birds dropped away instantly, peeling off in panic. One, slower than the rest, struck the ground near my feet, intact and dead before it stopped moving. The turbines didn't react. They kept turning, calm and even, as if this was exactly what they'd been built for. I stood there long after the air settled, staring down the length of the line, following it with my eyes until it disappeared into open sky. Ley lines, thermal corridors, old paths given new structure. Call them whatever you want. All I knew was this: the wind farm wasn't disrupting something ancient. It was completing it. I stopped walking across the site. After that day, I followed the service tracks exactly as they were laid out. No shortcuts, no drifting between towers unless I had to. It wasn't fear, not consciously. It was the same instinct that keeps you off soft ground or away from unstable edges. Some spaces are fine, until they aren't. The corridor showed itself more often after that. Not visually at first, physically. There were stretches where the wind pressed harder against my chest, as if it had weight, where my ears dulled and then cleared in quick succession, like crossing altitude changes that shouldn't exist at ground level. The sound of the blades would drop away for a heartbeat, replaced by a deep, empty quiet that made my stomach tighten. Step out of line, and it vanished. Step back in, and it returned. The turbines along that run began to behave differently. Not enough to trigger faults, not enough for anyone to question the data, but close enough that I noticed it. Their rotations synchronized just slightly when the wind shifted into the right direction, blades lining up long enough to create straight channels of movement through the farm. Those were the days the birds died. Not in dozens, not in dramatic piles. Just enough that you couldn't pretend it was coincidence anymore. Always beneath the same towers, always intact, always after the wind aligned just right. Bats followed the same rule. I watched one bird hesitate at the edge of the corridor, looping back on itself as if confused. Then it slipped sideways into the air between two towers and simply fell. No strike, no sound, just dropped, hitting the ground with a soft, final thud. Something moved above me then. Not fast, not diving, just passing through. The shadow stretched across multiple towers, unbroken by the blades, sliding between them as if it understood the spacing better than anything alive should. It didn't flap. It didn't glide in the way birds do. It rode the air the way smoke rides a current, shaped by it, not fighting it. The wind didn't change. The turbines didn't slow. They framed it. For the first time, I understood that the farm wasn't dangerous because it killed wildlife. It was dangerous because it guided things. The corridors weren't accidents. They were reinforced, strengthened every time the blades turned, every time the wind was pulled and shaped and sent somewhere specific. Something had learned the roots, something big enough that birds and bats were just collateral, pressure casualties in the wake of something that moved through the farm the way ships move through water. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the sky without looking directly at where I knew the corridor ran. My head rang faintly, like I'd stood too close to heavy machinery. That was when I realized something else. The alignments didn't end at the edges of the site. They extended beyond it, thinning out as the land dropped away. Lines running off toward the horizon, seen in the changing vegetation, boulders and animal tracks worn into the ground over long years of use. They faded in places, but never quite disappeared. The farm wasn't the source. It was the narrowest point. And whatever passed through it would do so again.
The change came without warning. Not a gust, not a shift in direction, just a heaviness in the air that settled across the site like a held breath. The grass between the towers bent slightly, not with the wind, but as if weighed down by it. Patches of vegetation darkened, thick and matted, following broad bands across the ground that had never shown up on any map. I felt it in my chest first, a pressure that didn't hurt exactly, just made each breath feel slightly insufficient. My ears dulled, sound flattening until the blades above me seemed farther away than they were. The wind was still there, moving, pushing, but it no longer felt empty. Birds scattered from the edges of the farm all at once, lifting hard and fast, refusing to cross the open space between the towers. One clipped the air, stalled, and fell. Another followed. They didn't strike anything, they just dropped, as if the sky had briefly forgotten how to hold them up. The turbines turned on. Not faster, not louder, just together. Across the site, blades aligned loosely, enough to shape the air without locking into anything precise. The thickened zones between the towers narrowed, drawn inward by motion and pressure, turning wide, indistinct spaces into something more deliberate. A path formed, not visible, but felt. I stood still, every instinct telling me not to move, not to step fully into the space between the towers, where the grass lay pressed flat and the insects clung in unnatural density to the bases of the structures. My head rang faintly, like standing too close to something powerful and unseen. Then the wind above me shifted. Something passed overhead. I never saw it properly. There was no outline to follow, no wings to count, no shape that stayed consistent long enough to name. Just a vast movement that darkened the sky for a heartbeat, stretching across multiple towers at once. The air pressed down as it moved, a rolling weight that carried with it the soundless thump of displaced pressure. Things dropped from the air as it passed, striking the ground intact and lifeless before they stopped moving. The blades didn't falter. They framed it, channeled the movement, reinforced the flow, turning a broad, ancient passage into a narrow, efficient route. Whatever rode the wind didn't slow. It didn't hunt. It didn't react to me at all. I was beneath it the way a stone is beneath a river. When the pressure eased, it was sudden. The air lightened. Sound returned in layers, wind first, then the distant rhythmic sweep of blades. My lungs burned as if I'd been holding my breath far longer than I realized. From the edge of the site, the farm looked unchanged. Towers turning, blades steady, sky empty. Only the ground told the truth. Bands of flattened grass, clusters of insects where there shouldn't have been any, small bodies scattered in quiet arcs beneath the towers that had aligned just long enough to matter. I left that day without filing a full report. There were boxes for wildlife strikes, for turbine faults, for maintenance anomalies and performance dips. There wasn't one for air behaving like a canal. The Windfarm is still there, still turning, still clean, still efficient. And on certain days, when the vegetation thickens, when the air grows heavy, when the birds refuse to cross open ground, something enormous passes through it, guided gently by structures we placed without ever understanding what they were narrowing. We call it renewable energy, but all we really did was make an old way through the land easier to follow.
People think landfills are dumped wherever there's space. They aren't. They're pushed away from towns and roads for a reason. The gases alone are dangerous. Methane, carbon monoxide, things that don't just poison the air, but can build pressure and explode if they're not managed properly. That same gas gets pulled out, burned, turned into electricity. Engines running off what's rotting beneath your feet. It's controlled decay, managed danger. I've worked landfills in old quarries, on disused airfields, even on land that used to be an ancient barrow fort once. Places already hollowed out or forgotten. Places people didn't argue too hard about losing. This one was different. There was a single access road, long and narrow, cutting through woodland that closed in tighter the further you drove. No houses, no farms, no signs you were anywhere near something industrial. Just trees pressing close on both sides, branches arching overhead like the road wasn't meant to be used anymore. About halfway in, the forest broke suddenly, not gradually, just stopped. The road opened out onto the remains of a stately home, or what was left of it. Stone walls blackened by fire, windows empty, roof long gone. Medieval by the look of it. The kind of place that would have had grounds stretching for miles once, formal gardens, long approaches. The landfill sat beyond it, spread across what must have been those old grounds. The ruin stood like it had been pushed aside to make room for it, too stubborn to be flattened completely. I remember thinking as I parked up that the place felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with waste or gas or ground conditions. Landfills are quieter than people expect. Most of the time it's just wind moving through the trees across open cells, catching on pipework and fencing. Sometimes you hear gas moving through the lines, a low hiss or flutter if you're standing close, but there's no constant noise to hide behind. That morning, even the wind felt wrong. The ruin sat on higher ground at the northern edge of the site, half screened by trees. From most of the working area you could see it if you looked up, blackened stone, roofless, watching over the landfill like it had been left there deliberately. I was working downslope from it, moving between wells that followed the old contours of the estate grounds. Open ground to my left, woodland to my right, the ruin always in my peripheral vision. The trees rustled without the air moving around me. Leaves shifted in short, uneven bursts, stopping abruptly, like something passing through them rather than over them. I started my checks. Gas wells first, caps secure, valves where they should be, readings within tolerance. My handheld monitor showed a full battery, exactly as it should. 5 minutes later, it dropped a bar. I frowned, tapped the screen, told myself it was the cold or a bad cell. By the time I reached the next well, the display dimmed slightly, like it was struggling to stay awake. I swapped devices. Same thing. No alarms, no faults, just power draining away. The birds lifted suddenly from the tree line beyond the ruin, not scattering, not calling, just gone. The sound of wings vanished almost instantly, leaving a silence that felt intentional. I looked up. The ruin hadn't changed. Same broken walls, same gaps where windows used to be. Something pale moved near it, not across the open ground, behind the stone. A brief shift at the edge of my vision, gone as soon as I focused on it. Corner of the eye stuff happens on isolated sites. Fatigue, light angles, too much empty space. You learn to ignore it. Still, I caught myself working with my body turned slightly uphill after that, keeping the ruin in sight, turning slower, listening harder. When my second monitor shut itself off without warning, battery empty, no low power alert, I stopped pretending the day was normal. I hadn't found a fault, but the sight felt aware of where I was standing. I was working closer to the ruin than I liked. The wells up there followed the higher ground, skirting the edge of what would have once been gardens. You could still see it in the land if you knew what to look for. Unnatural flatness, old boundaries softened, but not gone. The air felt heavier near the ruins, not warmer, just thicker. Sound didn't travel properly. The wind moved the trees behind me, but the grass around my boots stayed flat. Between two wells, placed neatly on a patch of exposed ground that hadn't been disturbed recently, sat a small, cuddly bear. Small, cheap, the kind you win or buy without thinking. It was holding a red fabric heart with white stitching that read, "I love you this much." The head had been torn off, not cleanly, not cut. The fabric was stretched and frayed like it had been pulled until it gave way. The head lay a short distance away, face turned toward the ruin. I stood there longer than I should have. Landfills get all sorts of things dumped on them, but this wasn't that. It wasn't buried. It wasn't thrown. It hadn't blown in. Someone had brought it here and set it down. My monitor flickered in my hand. The battery indicator dropped again, faster this time, the screen dimming as if something was leaning on it from the inside. I lowered it, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. No birds, no wind, just the trees behind the ruin rustling softly in a way that didn't match anything else. That was when I saw her properly. She stood just inside the tree line beyond the stone walls, grey from head to toe, still, watching. Her face wasn't clear, but her eyes were blue, pale, reflecting light that didn't seem to be there. I didn't shout, didn't wave, didn't move. She didn't react to being seen, didn't fade, didn't shift, just stood there like she'd been waiting for me to notice. When my monitor finally went black in my hand, I looked down for barely a second. When I looked back up, she was gone. The bear hadn't moved. I didn't touch it. I marked the location, forced myself to finish the last check in that area, and told myself I'd report it properly later. Someone else could deal with it. Security, management, anyone but me. As I walked down slope away from the ruin, I realized something else. Every time I glanced back uphill, it felt like I was the one being watched from behind. I didn't go straight back to the lower wells. Instead, I skirted the edge of the site, keeping distance between myself and the ruin without making it obvious. Old habit. You don't react unless there's something concrete to react to. The ground felt different up there, not unstable, just tense, like it hadn't finished settling. Gas readings started to drift, nothing dramatic, no alarms screaming, just numbers nudging upward where they normally sat flat, pressure building in pockets that should have equalized hours ago. I opened up one line, waited, watched it stabilize, then rise again a few minutes later, slow and steady. Condensate backed up in a low point that had never given trouble before. When I checked the pup and reopened the valve, it released with more force than it should have, splashing dark and foul-smelling across the gravel. I stepped back instinctively, heart thudding harder than the situation justified. I checked my watch. Too early in the day for this kind of behavior. The engines down by the compound coughed once, then settled. Not a fault, just enough to notice. I wrote everything down, times, readings, locations, the kind of notes you make when you want a paper trail later. The birds never came back. The forest stood still around the site, branches frozen in place, leaves barely stirring. Every now and then there was a rustle near the ruin, not loud, not sudden, just the suggestion of movement where there shouldn't have been any. I saw her twice more, once near a line of wells, standing where the ground dropped away sharply, grey against the green, and once inside the ruin itself, framed by a window opening that no longer had glass. Each time she was still. Each time her blue eyes found me immediately. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. The instruments were almost useless by then, batteries drained too quickly to trust, screens dimmed and lagged, responding a half-second slower than my hands. I stopped swapping units and started relying on experience instead, listening to the ground, watching the vents, trusting the way the site felt. And it felt wrong. Landfills are meant to be controlled, layered, contained. What's buried stays buried, slowly breaking down under pressure that's measured, managed, relieved. This place felt like it was pushing back. I stood there for a long moment, the ruin above me, the site below, and understood something I hadn't wanted to admit all day. Whatever was here wasn't reacting to the landfill. The landfill was reacting to it. I closed my notebook. I didn't finish the last few checks. I told myself I'd come back with someone else, with fresh kit, with daylight on my side, even though it was already day. As I walked toward the vehicle, I didn't look back uphill. I didn't need to. I could feel where she was. The forest didn't thin the way I expected. Instead, the road ended at a security fence, tall and industrial. The exit gate cut straight across the track, solid steel, padlocked. Beyond it, I could see the wider road, normal tarmac, space, distance. I slowed to a stop. The engine idled, loud in the quiet, too loud. I checked the mirror before opening the door. The back seat was empty. That almost made it worse. I got out and walked toward the gate, boots crunching on gravel that sounded far too sharp in the stillness. The forest pressed close on either side of the fence line. Branches rustled high above me, though there was no wind at ground level. The padlock was stiff. My hands shook enough that I missed the keyhole the first time. Metal scraped against metal, the sound carrying farther than it should have. That was when I noticed how quiet it had become behind me. Not just an absence of noise, an absence of space. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel her there, close enough that the hairs on my arms lifted, close enough that the air behind me felt occupied, watching, waiting. Not impatient. The lock finally gave with a dull click. I swung the gate open, got back into the car, and drove through without looking to either side. Once clear, I stopped again to secure the site and lock the gate. I got out a second time. The gate felt heavier now as I pulled it closed. The hinges creaked, slow and deliberate, like they were dragging the moment out on purpose. I slid the padlock through and snapped it shut, the finality of the sound sending a sharp jolt through me. I turned, then. She stood on the inside of the fence, just beyond the reach of the gate, grey against the trees, still, her blue eyes fixed on me, calm and familiar, like this was always how it was meant to end. She hadn't followed me out. She hadn't needed to. I got back into the car and locked the doors without thinking. The engine was already running. I pulled away hard, tires biting into the road as I put distance between myself and the gate. I didn't slow down once I reached the main road. I didn't report what happened. There are procedures for pressure events, for gas migration, for equipment faults and security breaches. There isn't one for things that wait until you stop moving. I never went back to that landfill. But sometimes, when I'm locking up somewhere quiet, I feel that same stillness behind me, and I make sure the engine is running before I turn the key.
The buzz was already there when I stepped inside the rows. You don't notice it at first. It isn't loud. It doesn't rise or fall. It just sits under everything. A thin electrical vibration that makes the air feel tight. On bright days, it's constant. Panels warming. Inverters working somewhere out of sight. Normal. From the outside, the solar farm looked flat, ordered, sensible. From inside it, the land disappeared. The panels were fixed on their frames, angled away from me, the lower edges usually about knee height, except where the ground dipped or rose, lifting them higher. In places, the slope carried them up until the top edge sat well above my head, glass and steel closing off the sky. After 3 rows, I couldn't see the fence anymore. There was no long view, no horizon. Just repeating corridors of panels stretching forward in straight lines that all looked the same once you were inside them. The buzz followed me, unchanged, vibrating faintly through the metal and into the soles of my boots. I stopped and listened. No wind, no birds, just the hum. I took another row to the left, then another. I should have been able to see the access track by now. Instead, the panels rose and fell with the ground, masking the slope completely. It felt like walking through something folded. That was when I saw movement. Low, fast, gone before my eyes could settle on it. Something passed beneath the panels 2 rows ahead, a smear of shadow sliding through the gap, hugging the ground. Too quick to track properly, too smooth to be a rabbit. I stood still, waiting for a second movement that didn't come. The buzz didn't change. I told myself it was nothing. Light playing tricks. An animal spooked by footsteps. The place was full of them. Foxes, badgers, anything that liked cover. Still, I waited a few seconds longer than I needed to. Then I carried on. I found the badger 3 rows in. It was wedged beneath the frame like it had been pushed there and left. Not torn apart, not scattered, just wrong. Its body lay on its side, legs stiff, fur flattened where it pressed against the metal. The head was twisted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it. The buzz carried on, unbothered. Badgers turn up on sites all the time. They dig, they squeeze through gaps they shouldn't fit through. I'd seen plenty dead before. Road strikes, collapses, the odd one that hadn't made it back out of a hole. This wasn't that. There were marks in the dirt beneath it, long, shallow lines pressed straight through the soil between the supports. Not paw prints, no scatter, just a dragged path that vanished under the next panel. I crouched without thinking, hand hovering where the fur met the frame. Cold. Not the damp cold of something left overnight, the kind of cold that felt like it had been there longer than it should have, longer than something that still looked this intact. I stood up quickly and stepped back. The rows closed in again as soon as I moved away from it, the identical corridors swallowing the view. I tried to get my bearings, counting turns, but every angle looked the same once the panels blocked the sky. Something moved. Not where the badger was. Further along, low and fast again, slipping under the gap like water poured along the ground. This time I caught more of it. Not a shape, not properly, just a sense of length. Too long for a fox. Too flat for anything that should have legs. I turned, scanning the row beside me. Nothing. The buzz pressed on, steady and indifferent. It felt louder now, not because it had changed, but because everything else had fallen away. I didn't kneel by the badger again. I walked on instead, eyes fixed on the dark spaces beneath the panels, watching the places where something could move without ever needing to show itself. I reminded myself why I was there. Overnight storm, high winds, driving rain, the kind that rattles fixings loose and shifts things just enough to matter. My job was simple. Walk the rows, check for cracked glass, twisted frames, anything that would turn into a bigger problem if it was ignored. Normal work. Boring work. I started doing what I always did after a storm. Slow walk. eyes up, looking for spiderweb fractures, bent brackets, cables pulled tighter than they should be. The buzz stayed constant, vibrating faintly through the frames whenever I brushed past them. Water had pooled where the ground dipped. Thin brown puddles stretched between supports, their surfaces unbroken. The mud around them was marked, shallow grooves running straight through, as if something had been dragged while the soil was still soft. I told myself it was debris. Branches, something blown in and pulled loose. Still, I followed the marks. They led under another row, then another. Each time I ducked to look beneath the panels, I half expected something to dart out. Nothing did. I stopped beside a frame that had shifted slightly. Not damaged, just out enough to catch the eye. I reached up, testing it gently. That was when the movement happened again. Closer this time. A shadow slid beneath the panel directly to my right, so near I felt the air move with it. It didn't bolt. It didn't scramble. It glided, pressed flat to the ground, following the line of the frame like it knew exactly how much space it needed. I straightened slowly, heart kicking harder than it should have. "Fox," I said out loud. The buzz swallowed the word. I forced myself to keep walking, but now I checked every panel faster than I needed to, and every time I bent to look underneath, part of me expected to find something waiting there. Low, patient, listening to the same constant hum that told it the sun was still up. After a while, I realized I was no longer checking panels properly. I was moving too fast, eyes flicking down instead of up, watching the gaps, watching the shadows. The buzz stayed with me, unchanged, a pressure behind my ears. I turned into another row and stopped. The scrape marks were back, fresh, clear. 2 shallow lines pressed into the damp soil, closer together than I liked, running straight ahead before disappearing beneath the next panel. I crouched, careful not to touch them. The mud was still soft. Then the buzz shifted, not stopping, just thinning slightly, like something passing through it rather than over the ground. The scrape came again, 1 row to my left. I took a step forward. So did it. I stopped. It stopped too. We stayed like that, me frozen between identical corridors, it hidden just out of sight. I could feel it now, not fear exactly, but certainty. Something was moving alongside me, using the rows the same way I was. I cut abruptly into the next row. A heartbeat later, the scrape followed. Delayed. Intentional. Animals panic. They bolt. This didn't. I kept walking, counting rows, trying to remember where the fence should be. The land no longer felt flat. The panels rose higher ahead, blocking the sky completely. Then I saw daylight. The rows ended all at once. One step I was boxed in by glass and steel. The next, the farm opened out, and the sky rushed back in. The perimeter fence stood ahead of me, dull and solid, running straight across the land like a hard line drawn through everything behind it. I didn't stop moving. Gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the access strip, the buzz fading slightly as I cleared the last panel. The air felt looser out here, like I could finally breathe properly. I reached the fence and grabbed it without thinking. Only then did I turn. From the outside, the solar farm looked exactly how it should. Long, flat rows. Orderly. Harmless. Then something shifted. Not low this time. A shadow lifted beneath the panels I'd just come from, compressing itself against the underside of the glass. It didn't stand fully upright, just rose enough for its mass to become undeniable. Too tall for an animal. Too solid to be light. The buzz thinned around it, like the sound was being pushed aside. The shape paused at the edge of the row, panels breaking it into fragments. Curve, bulk, darkness. Never enough to see it whole. I stepped back. It didn't follow. After a moment, it lowered itself again, flattening smoothly until it was nothing more than shadow under glass. The buzz returned to normal, like nothing had ever moved beneath it. Later, in the report, I wrote about storm debris and minor frame movement. I mentioned the dead badger. I didn't speculate. There's no box on the form for anything that doesn't fit. There are places designed so no one ever needs to look inside them properly. Solar farms are one of those places. And whatever moves between the rows knows that.
They come searching for power. They might learn to take hours.